Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the special Brennan Center for Justice event. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to revitalize, strengthen, and defend our systems of democracy and justice so they work for all Americans. I am Wendy Weiser, Vice President for Democracy here at the Brennan Center. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan organization. While we cannot support or oppose any candidate for office, we can, and today we will, vigorously discuss and debate the policies and positions that matter for our democracy. Civility is important to all of us. Those who post rude and intemperate language in our message streams here on YouTube and Facebook will be removed from the conversation. Live closed captioning will be provided. And please follow along on social media with the hashtag Brennan Center Live. Now to today's program. The United States Congress has long been mired in dysfunction, making it unable to address many of the pressing challenges facing our country. According to a recent poll, and many others, the majority of Americans have hardly any confidence at all in the Congress. There are multiple reasons for this dysfunction, but one of the most significant is the subject of an important new book, Filibustered: How to Fix the Broken Senate and Save America, by Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon and his former Chief of Staff, Mike Zamore, currently the National Policy and Government Affairs Director at the American Civil Liberties Union. The filibuster is an arcane rule of Senate procedure that, in its current form, essentially prevents national legislation from getting an up or down vote in the Senate unless 60 senators agree. As we will hear, this rule has had all sorts of bad consequences, including for our democracy. Just 2 years ago, Congress considered a transformative piece of legislation that would have addressed many of the biggest problems plaguing our democracy and elections today, from vote suppression to election subversion, to unfettered money in politics, to gerrymandering. The Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act was wildly popular among both the American public and our national lawmakers. It passed the House of Representatives. A majority of senators supported it and stood ready to pass it, and President Biden stood ready to sign it into law. But the bill died in the Senate, a victim of the filibuster, after winning a heartbreaking 58 of the 60 votes needed to overcome that obstacle. That is not how democracy is supposed to work. As it turns out, a relatively simple tweak could make a huge difference. Here to discuss that reform and their new book, I am thrilled to say, are Senator Merkley and Mike Zamore. In addition to writing critical books and representing the good state of Oregon, Senator Merkley has been a national leader and champion on democracy issues and the lead Senate sponsor of the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. We applaud your leadership and are honored to welcome you both. I will now turn things over to our esteemed moderator for today's event, Kimberly Atkins Stohr, senior opinion writer and columnist for the Boston Globe. Thank you, Kimberly. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Wendy. It is such a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon. Just a little note off the top, which I hope is relatable. I took a little spill in my kitchen this week, and so if you see my lip a little fuller than it normally is, it's because it's swollen. But I may sound and look slightly different, but the show must go on because this topic is just so important. You know, we've all heard complaints about how broken, partisan, and dysfunctional Congress is, and that's something that affects all of us. But how did we get to this place of nonstop gridlock? And is there any hope of escaping it? The new book, written by Senator Jeff Merkley and his former Chief of Staff, Mike Zamore, offers us an insider's view of the sources of that deadlock. Filibustered: How to Fix the Broken Senate and Save America argues that Congress's decline began 50 years ago with the introduction of the no-talk filibuster, which allows senators to block a bill without the pain and suffering associated with holding the Senate floor indefinitely. In other words, Mr. Smith doesn't have to go to Washington, or at least he doesn't have to stay on the Senate floor. We believe that eliminating the no-talk filibuster, they believe that eliminating the no-talk filibuster would do so much to restore order to the legislature. And we're so lucky to have them with us today. Senator Jeff Merkley, co-author of the book Filibustered, How to Fix the Broken Senate and Save America, and Mike Zamore, National Policy and Government Affairs Director at the ACLU, co-author of the book. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with you.
Now, I have so many questions for you both. I want to say to the audience, we will get to your questions. We will save some time at the end of today's discussion to bring your questions in, so you can send them to us along the way, and we will get to those. So Senator Merkley, who I would just say, just dashed back from a vote. That's how important this discussion is for him, and made it back in time. We've been in Congress since 2009. What has surprised you most about Congress?
You know, what surprised me most was the absolute level of gridlock and paralysis. Back in 1976, so almost a half century ago, I was an intern for Senator Hatfield. I worked on the Tax Reform Act. It had 125 votes, no supermajority to get to the floor, no supermajority on an amendment, no supermajority cloture of any kind. Every senator could offer whatever amendment they thought was important. And there was not this wasted time spending a week trying to close debate on a motion to proceed or an amendment or on final passage. Now, between the slow walking of nominations and the absolute paralysis on policy bills that the minority doesn't like, the Senate's in deep trouble and not serving the American people.
So how has that dysfunction gotten worse in your decade and a half in the Senate?
Well, it's tremendously worse. And what we've seen is an amplification of the everyday use of the filibuster. If we think about how many times there were cloture motions voted on between 1917 and 1964, the answer is just 6 times. Now, the motion was made more often, but you can see in this chart how virtually decade after decade, there were basically nothing until we hit 64. And then we see this acceleration. And so if you're looking at this chart and thinking about when I came in, the second bar to the right in 2009, in the middle of that chart, what we saw from that point forward was not just more cloture motions on final passage of bills, but more obstruction on amendments, a lot more obstruction on motions to proceed to bills. So we're spending a week debating whether to debate a bill. It's a complete waste of the time of 100 talented people. And then with McConnell, an absolute use of the filibuster on nominations to slow walk everything, just an explosion of that obstruction on nominations. The complete impact of this has been that so many issues never get to the floor for debate. Important issues that could have been introduced, debated, voted on, never get there. It's a Senate much more designed now, rigged to serve the powerful and obstruct the opportunity to serve the people.
So, Mike, you have spent decades in Congress as well, and you're an expert on Senate procedure. In the book, you note that from the very beginning, Congress rejected the idea of a supermajority vote for ordinary business. Can you walk us through the way that has changed?
Sure. Thank you, Kimberly. If you've been watching Congress or the Senate over the last couple of decades, you probably think 60 votes is the norm, and that's how business gets done. That was emphatically rejected, as you're saying, Kimberly, by the founders. So you'll recall from your American history, if it's in the recesses, that the Constitution was not the first organizing document for the new United States after the Revolution. There was a short period of time when they had something called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were kind of like the EU, where it was independent states that were joining together to work together, and they had a weak Congress that was able to act only when it had a supermajority of votes. So it would take usually 3/4 of the state delegations to agree before this national government could do anything. And it was absolutely debilitating for this new baby country that had just been created. So they couldn't pay the Revolutionary War pensions. They couldn't do pretty much anything effectively because someone was always objecting. So when they were designing the Constitution, the point was to be able to act. And so Madison and Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Papers about the idea of supermajority requirements and said, no, do not do that. It's a terrible mistake. Every time a body has a supermajority requirement, it winds up producing contemptible compromises and things like that. This is the founders of the country who are saying this. So, not surprisingly, when Congress convened for the first time and the first Senate met, they, were figuring out how to do their business, and the mechanism for passing legislation was a simple majority vote, as envisioned by the Constitution, and that was the norm. So what happened was in that first Congress and thereafter, you came up with a sort of a code, a social contract that allowed every senator to have their say. They would sometimes speak at length, and there's a great quote from one of the first senators in the very first Congress talking about a colleague who wouldn't shut up and how painful it was to listen to him. It was not always enjoyable, but they all knew that if they gave someone else the chance to have their say, to offer amendments, they would have the same opportunity, and at the end, they would have the simple majority vote. That's how the Senate worked for most of 200 years. Obviously, there were exceptions, and the filibuster arose, and we can talk about how that happened. But it's worth noting that the filibuster was seen as a beyond the bounds abuse of the rules, and it was rare, and it was a violation of this code that had existed. And lest you think it is ancient history, into the 1990s, really controversial legislation passed without ever getting 60 votes. So in the 90s, you saw both the partial birth abortion ban and the assault weapons ban both passed without ever getting 60 votes. So this was the way the Senate operated for most of its history on most things. And the what has emerged, the senator is describing that kind of hockey stick graph of filibusters, is a very modern phenomenon.
Well, let me ask you this. I want to talk about the filibuster. Has it ever functioned effectively in Congress, and what did that look like, Mike?
I mean, the filibuster was emerged in 1841 as a tool for the slaveholding elites of the South to try to hold on to their economic power, first on a national bank bill. And, as President Obama said so powerfully at Congressman Lewis's funeral, it is a Jim Crow relic. And we should talk more about the role of the filibuster in preserving a white supremacy political system.
Sure, and I want to give that question to Senator Merkley.
Yeah, so I'll stick a pin in that, but just to say that the filibuster has always existed as a tool for elites to hold on to minority power. Like, that's what it emerged as, and that's what it always served as. The difference is it used to be deployed sparingly, and now it's deployed constantly.
So I on that point, Senator Merkley, I know when I began covering Congress, I would hear all the time that the filibuster is important to encourage consensus. But then the more I learned about its history, especially when it comes to civil rights legislation, it really sort of changed my perspective of it. Can you tell us more about how the history of the filibuster intertwined with efforts to build a multiracial democracy?
You bet. So the Southerners initially said, hey, we've got to stop the power of the North economically, but we also have to stop any sort of protection for voting rights and participation. There had been a huge surge after the Civil War in participation, democratic participation, and a lot of Black Americans were elected to local office and national office. And we had 2 Black senators from Mississippi, for example. But the Southerners said, well, the strategy that we thought we could use was nullification. That is, we could nullify the federal laws. But that was thrown out by Jackson, said, no way. Congress declared war on South Carolina. South Carolina relented. That was the end of that. So now, how to stop civil rights? Well, the idea became, let's wrap extended speech in the ideal of the First Amendment and freedom of speech, and call any effort to curtail speech an assault leading to tyranny. But it was to embed in a righteous frame a really evil obstruction of the rights of Black Americans, Indian Americans as well. And so this is how it proceeded. And really about the only thing that was blocked through 1891 were civil rights. After the big battle in 1891 over the effort to restore civil rights in the South, the filibuster killed it. The filibuster was used more widely on other topics, but it returned to blocking civil rights after the 1917 introduction of a cloture motion, including anti-lynching legislation, poll tax legislation, and so forth. So that really culminated in 1964. Since then, we have seen the filibuster start to expand, and then a significant reform in 1975 that backfired because it made the filibuster, which took a lot of effort to keep speaking, making motions, appearing for quorum calls and so forth, into a no appearance, no effort obstruction. This no effort obstruction set the stage for the massive expansion. And really, I have to throw McConnell into this and really Gingrich, because if we think back to the election of Gingrich as Speaker in the House, Gingrich's theory of power was that if you're in the minority and you obstruct the majority, you have a better case to tell voters, get rid of that majority. They were ineffective. Put us in power. And it's a very, very cynical strategy. It's one Mitch McConnell said, boy, that gives obstruction. Gingrich gives obstruction a good name. He comes over to the Senate, McConnell does, and McConnell has these tools that the House could only dream about. One is nominations, and the second is the filibuster. And with that, he set about really paralyzing the Obama administration.
So you both argue in the book that a return of the talking filibuster, which always gives me that vision of Jimmy Stewart, that would greatly reduce the gridlock in Congress. Mike, can you tell us how?
Sure. So the way the Senate worked when it was working well was that every senator had a chance to have their say, offer amendments. There was a robust debate, and then the Senate would ultimately finish a bill by having a simple majority vote. And that was enforced by code, really by social contract, not by rule. The idea behind the talking filibuster is to bring back those dynamics and to give both sides, the majority and the minority, opportunity to influence the legislative process, to draw attention to the issues that they care about, to force accountability for members, senators' positions on the issues, and to encourage and incentivize negotiation and compromise, which is, really what made the Senate kind of famous as the world's greatest deliberative body. To do that, both sides need to have a reason to come to the table and to talk to each other and to reach across the aisle. You talked about, Kimberly, about the idea that the filibuster as it currently exists promotes compromise. And obviously we don't see compromise breaking out all over the US Senate, right? It is just not something that is a dominant feature of today's politics. Not because the minority has no incentive to negotiate, right? They can block whatever they want. It's a minority veto in our current politics. The talking filibuster would require members of the minority who want to block a vote on legislation to actually go back to the Senate floor and speak at length and make their case and do the hard work and stay through the night. Senator Merkley can speak to the difficulty of waging an all-night filibuster because he's actually done it. It's not easy, and it requires commitment. And so by requiring that commitment, you'll dramatically reduce the incentives to hold things up. Whereas today, if a senator wants to filibuster, what that means is they basically have a staff member send an email to the leadership staff, and then a 60-vote cloture vote is required, and that's the end of the bill in many cases. So trying to restore that sense of responsibility and investment, and make obstruction an active thing to do rather than a passive act of of minority rule, essentially, is the goal behind the talking filibuster.
So Mike, as Senator Merkley mentioned earlier, the Senate can waste a lot of time, and the non-talking filibuster was introduced in 1975 as a way, among other things, to save time. Would a return of the talking filibuster mean more wasted time then?
Well, it depends how you define wasting time, I think. The talking filibuster would certainly require, on some pieces of major legislation, like Wendy was talking in her intro about the For the People Act, which we got so close but didn't get over the finish line in January of 2022. A bill like that might spend weeks on the floor while you're trying to break a talking filibuster. By the way, one thing I should note is that core to our proposal is to ensure that the talking filibuster will come to an end. And so we can talk about the mechanism for that, but it is important to note that filibusters of old were rarely broken by just waiting senators out, because the tools are weak and the incentives are imbalanced, and we can discuss more about why that's so. But what we're proposing is really a way to make sure that talking filibuster will come to an end eventually. And yes, it might take a lot of time, but on the issues that are of paramount importance to the majority and then presumably to the American public, I would argue that's not wasted time. That is an investment in setting the terms of our political debate and ensuring that we get to the priorities that the American people care about. What you wouldn't have as much is days and weeks of doing nothing on the Senate floor while you wait out cloture votes on bills or nominations that will end up passing with 90 votes, which was what we have today. The cloture process was designed to be time consuming because it was expected to be very rare. And so that's been exploited by the minority, and you have 97-2 votes on nominees, but you have to go get a cloture motion passed, and that takes a couple of days to do, and then a couple of days after, and suddenly you've wasted a week on a motion to debate, as the senator said, debating a bill, or you wasted another 5 days on a nomination that passes unanimously. We've got to get all that wasted time out of the system and focus on the actual legislating. The legislative process shouldn't be, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, in the Senate the way it sometimes is in the House. We don't think, because deliberation is important, but you want to be spending the time in ways that's productive.
So, Senator Merkley, you argue in the book that dark money and special interests have really changed the incentive structure in the Senate. Can you explain how it has and what it would take to fix that?
Yes, taking a step back from the Senate for a moment, our current political system is rigged for the powerful. We have this huge inequity of wealth, and that wealth is brought to bear in the form of lobbyists, in the form of lawyers, in the form of media campaigns to shape how people think, in the form of regular campaign donations to elect people the powerful want, and in the form of dark money to smear candidates the powerful don't want. And so when you think about, well, why don't we negotiate the price of drugs like every other, and we pay 2 to 10 times as much for individual drugs because we don't negotiate. And it's universally popular among Democrats, independents, Republicans. Why don't we get that done? Well, it's this power structure that I'm talking about. But if all of that fails, then the drug companies have the filibuster, getting 41 votes from the minority to block the end of debate. No effort by the minority at all. So the dark money piece, now that you asked specifically about, this is new. Citizens United essentially said, hey, if you're an average citizen, the law requires you to make a donation. If you make a donation of more than $200 to be disclosed. But if you're a billionaire or a multimillionaire and you want to put 5 million, 10 million, 20 million into a political race, and you give it to a friend of the candidate instead of the candidate, you don't have to be disclosed. You can do this secretly. And the Supreme Court, I think in a massive violation of any concept of justice, said this is okay to have secret donations by the very rich used primarily in negative attack ads. So that's the role of dark money. And so when we had the For the People Act, Senate Bill number 1, my bill in the 21-22 session, and it basically, a piece of that was to take on gerrymandering. The bulk of it was to take on the election process, protect registration, protect voting, protect vote counting, protect people at the polls, encourage ability to use vote by mail, whole series of provisions, many of which the Brennan Center was so helpful in supporting and crafting. But then also the Disclose Act, which is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's bill, was incorporated into that, saying all political donations have to be disclosed. What's good for you and me as average citizens is good for the millionaire, billionaire class.
So, Mike, sometimes it's easy for filibuster to seem like a benign feature of the Senate or inside baseball. Even as a journalist, I sometimes struggle to explain why people should care so much about it. Can you talk to us about the way that the filibuster and its the way that it has helped to break the Senate harms Americans across the board?
Sure thing. I mean, at a very specific level, the Senate is rigged. Republicans have used kind of forced through rules changes to ensure that they can do their top priorities by simple majority vote, which is pass tax cuts for the millionaires and billionaires and giant corporations, and stack the courts with conservative judges who will, wage an ideological war. So they're getting what they want, but the filibuster blocks so many of the priorities that the American people repeatedly ask for and vote for. So, for example, we start the book in our first chapter talking about the gun reform efforts after Sandy Hook, when a classroom full of first graders was murdered, and there was this widespread belief that we've got to do something, and this time it's going to be different. And you even had two dyed-in-the-wool NRA A rating gun supporting senators come up with a compromise, Pat Toomey and Joe Manchin, that would finally close the background check loophole. And that's supported by 85 or 90% of Americans. And it came to the Senate floor, and it was blocked. And it got 54 votes, I think it was, which is a majority. And, as every kid on the playground knows, whatever has the most support should win. If the majority of the kids want to play kickball, they play kickball. And in this case, the American people see repeatedly the things they ask for, the things they want, the things that they support and that their representatives support still don't happen. And so it's a huge attack on democracy, on the whole fundamental notion that we, the people, should decide what our government does. And so what the filibuster really is it's the minority hijacking the levers of government. And it gives us minority rule instead of majority rule. And that is corrosive in our country. And it is fueling cynicism. And the right now, I think we all feel this palpable sense that our democracy is teetering. And we could talk about all the examples, and I don't think any of us need to raise our blood pressure that way right now. But we all feel it, and I think there's a direct line between the explosion of filibustering that you saw on that graph earlier in this discussion, and the cratering support for democracy as a general governing system. People don't think it works because it's not working for them.
So relatedly, Senator Merkley, I want to ask you a follow on that. As you talk to your constituents in Oregon and Americans beyond that, do you think that there is that understanding that Mike is talking about the impact of the filibuster on their everyday lives?
Mostly the answer is no. We did see a surge of understanding among groups that were advocating for a host of issues, environmental issues, housing policy, healthcare policy. But you're basically talking about folks engaged in policy and see it hitting the rocks in the Senate. They see that obstruction. While most Americans, what happens on Capitol Hill is just kind of a, illegitimate complaint. Oh, we can't pass a bill because the minority is obstructing it, the reaction of the public is, you're in the majority, figure it out, get it done. And it's a legitimate response. The Republicans used a nuclear option so they could get their priorities done by simple majority. So why are Democrats sitting around accepting a situation in which Republicans campaign on an agenda and can deliver, and Democrats campaigning on better policy in a whole series of areas that affect the kitchen table and working Americans cannot deliver because of the 41-vote Republican veto? It's an unacceptable situation, but not broadly understood. It's too much, as they say, inside baseball. But what is growing is that across the country, as people campaign and do campaign events, more and more audiences are saying, so you laid out these policies, what are you going to do about reforming the filibuster so they have a chance of passing? So those who are engaged in kind of listening to candidates are starting to get that message, and certainly the candidates for the Senate are getting the message.
So, Senator, given the fact that the public is where they are and there has been no sign of any changes coming to the system, do you think that there is an appetite for these sort of reforms that you and Mike lay out in the book at the moment?
There is, on the Democratic side of the aisle, because Democrats are obstructed by the 41-vote silent filibuster, yes, huge appetite. And on the Republican side, because they can already deliver their agenda, because they made their tax cut strategy a simple majority strategy with a nuclear option back in 1996, the Republicans are not in that same situation. But here's what matters. To be able to reinterpret the rules using the template that Robert Byrd created when he was majority leader. So you had this interesting situation where the man who was the fiercest defender of the filibuster to protect against civil rights bills, that is to kill civil rights bills, was also responsible as a majority leader to make the Senate function. So when the Republicans developed various strategies to stall everything, he would do a point of order. The point of order would reinterpret the rules. The chair would either support him or oppose him. If the chair supported him, they would table an appeal and therefore win. And if the chair opposed him, he had the votes to overturn the ruling of the chair and create a new precedent. So Byrd laid out the template saying, if obstruction gets out of hand, we have to curtail it. And at the end of his life, one of the last essays that Robert Byrd put forward, was to say the filibuster should be used on rare occasions for deep issues of conscience, and this current use of paralyzing the Senate from ordinary legislating is outrageous and must end. I wish we could have had 50 senators in January 22 listen to that last essay by Robert Byrd, but we only had 48. We needed 2 more, but we didn't get those 2.
So I have a question for both of you. The book argues that the talking filibuster will solve some major problems in Congress, but it's not a panacea, right? What are the big issues that wouldn't go away, even with the kind of reform you propose? Mike, I'll start with you and then I'll go to the senator.
I mean, look, we've got a very, very deeply polarized country right now. And the politics of the elected members of Congress and state governments reflect the politics of the people who elect them. And so I don't think that's not going to go away, right? If we have a Senate that can function, it doesn't mean it will function. And we all saw the challenges in the last Congress when we had 50 Democrats and trying to get even the big reconciliation package passed. Like, constructing a majority is difficult. And the Republicans ran into the same problem when they tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So achieving consensus around legislation isn't easy. We still have massive challenges with dark money in our politics. We have all kinds of other things that, if we could pass legislation, we could do something to address. But the underlying dynamics of our politics are hard, and our system is built for stasis. This is like James Madison's cruel practical joke on America is, they constructed a constitutional system that has lots of veto points, even if you take the filibuster out of the equation, right? Like you have to pass the House, you have to pass the Senate, you got to get signed by the president. We have courts that are pretty aggressive in a lot of cases. So there's a lot to do to be able to deliver on government of, by, and for the people. And we still have the Electoral College, which is broken and empowers the minority. We have the structure of the Senate, which still empowers sparsely populated rural states. There's a lot of things that will make it hard to deliver the things that people want to see in their daily lives. But taking the filibuster out of the equation is a big step in the right direction.
Senator Merkley?
Sure. I mean, even if the Senate can function, it can only pass a bill if you have the Senate, the House, and the president all lined up. But it creates a possibility. We could have passed the For the People, or Freedom to Vote Act, as it was relabeled. That would have had a huge impact on protecting the ballot box. We could have passed gun legislation, the Manchin-Toomey Act. We could have passed the Disclose Act. We had 59 votes for it twice, but not 60 to close debate. We could have passed the DREAM Act. We could have passed legislation to stop the gouging on drugs, because when we had the House, the Senate, and the presidency lined up, and people would have said, well, look, we elected these folks to do these things and they're getting them done. How did that suddenly start to happen? They wouldn't necessarily have understood that it was because we got rid of the 41 vote veto of the silent filibuster, but they'd be seeing the results and going, hey, government's starting to work for us again. They're considering labor legislation to make it easier to organize a union. They're considering reproductive rights, to protect their rights of women to have a full range of reproductive healthcare services, including abortion. And that sense that, the cycle of government in which you elect people who share your goals, they can pass legislation and try that out. And if people like it, they reelect them. And if they don't like them, they throw them out. That would be a magnificent change from the current broken cycle where majorities have been elected to do an agenda and the agenda cannot pass. So that's definitely a big piece of the puzzle as we face this kind of appetite for more authoritarian government. Well, why? Well, the democracy is not working well. Nobody around the world right now is looking at America as a model about how to run a country. They see a corrupted process. They see a court that has been basically fixed through a stolen seat and a strategy by Mitch McConnell. They see a House that can't hardly elect a speaker and doesn't want to pass things when the majority of the votes come from the minority party or half the votes come. They see that after 200 years of practice, we're doing far worse than when the Senate and House first came in as a novice legislative process. So if we do not fix this, our democracy is in big trouble.
Okay, we are getting so many really good questions from our audience, and we will turn to those in just a moment, but I'm going to take the privilege as moderator to ask a question on my behalf. First, Senator, given all the problems that you and Mike have laid out today, given the history of the filibuster as a tool to block civil rights legislation, why reform it as opposed to getting rid of it altogether?
Yes. So if we get rid of it, then what you have is a Senate where the views of the minority carry no weight. The majority just runs over the top of the minority. It is our belief that it is a much healthier legislative process when the minority has a voice, not a veto, but they have leverage. And let me explain the leverage. The majority can't afford for bills to be on the floor week after week after week because of so much business that has to be accomplished. The minority is going to have great difficulty keeping people talking continuously through the night, through the weekend, through the break. So both have an incentive to compromise and work out a deal. If ultimately there is no deal and the majority persists, yes, they can get to a final vote, but it would take multiple weeks to get there. In most cases, on smaller bills, a talking filibuster would begin on a Thursday night because the Senate normally adjourns on a Thursday night. Begin on a Thursday night, it'd be over by midnight, because people would not stay the weekend, go through the night on most bills. Big, profound bills such as reproductive rights or voting rights, or perhaps labor rights, yes, that battle might go on for weeks, but in most cases, it would be very short termination of debate and the ability to have a final vote.
Okay, so Senator, our first question from the audience is for you. Why do you think this kind of reform has a chance to pass now as opposed to in the last few years?
Well, so if we turn the clock back to the first time I put forward the talking filibuster, it was 2011. We had 40 plus votes, but being done as a rule rather than a reinterpretation. It needed 67 votes. We were a long ways from it. In January of 22, we had 50 Democrats and associated independents, and 48 out of the 50 said, yes, let's reinterpret the rules to create the talking filibuster and end this aberration, this secret, silent, no public conversation, no effort version that we have at the moment. So we were just 2 votes short. With every senator who's running as a Democrat, every candidate running as a Democrat is understanding this now, every single one. So if we have a majority in the future, we're going to have the votes to be able to enact this reform.
Okay, our next question is, what did the founders think of the filibuster? Mike, you are our procedural expert. I'll let you take a stab at that one.
Well, I'll let Alexander Hamilton answer this. What he said was the history of every political establishment in which this principle of supermajority decision making has prevailed is a history of impotence, perplexity, and disorder. So they never envisioned the filibuster. It never occurred to them that senators would just throw sand in the gears and try to talk bills to death and prevent them from being enacted. All of the founders who were in the first Senate actually, established the playbook of how the Senate would work, and they had rules that required that senators could only speak twice on a given issue on a given day to try to make sure things moved along. They had admonishments in Thomas Jefferson's manual. He was a parliamentary guru, and he wrote a manual that said nobody should speak excessively. And they actually had a rule that was virtually never used, but a motion that allowed the majority to finish the debate and just like close things down and finish a bill if they needed to do so. So the expectation when this whole thing got going, this experiment was, look, we tried supermajorities with the Articles of Confederation. It was a disaster. We need a federal government that's able to actually get stuff done, including passing bills to the United States Senate. They have no conception that we would be wrapped around a 60-vote axle 200 years later.
So, Senator, the next question asks, does there need to be some mechanism to prevent the tyranny of the majority? You sort of got to this a bit when answering my question. Can you expound on that a little bit?
You bet. The thing that creates the protection against the tyranny of the majority is a talking filibuster. It means that on very rare occasions is the majority going to be able to drive something through without working out a deal with the minority. And if you are forced to debate publicly for 3-4 weeks or more, and knowing that the public is watching this extraordinary experience, it would have been extraordinary in January 22 if we had launched on the talking filibuster, had those 2 votes, and debated the issue of voting rights for 6 weeks. If the public is with you, they will call you a hero. And if they are against you, they will call you a bomb. So you have the accountability before public opinion that comes from the talking filibuster. And so if you're out of sync with the public, the talking filibuster is not something that you want to expose yourself to. And this protects against the tyranny of the majority.
Okay, the next question is, why hasn't Senate Majority Leader Schumer made a move toward filibuster reform? Either one of you want to take that on?
Well, he has, because he absolutely backed the talking filibuster in January of 22 on the For the People, Freedom to Vote Act. And so it's something that we had a year of conversations about how we were going to address this. Realized we had the states that were passing all kinds of obstruction to registration and to voting, and a lot of concerns about vote counting even. And even now we see a lot of those state passed laws having an impact on this coming election. And so that conversation was intense. He was involved in it all the way through. And part of the conversation was the substance of the bill, getting 50 sponsors. We had 49 for the people, and we didn't have Joe Manchin. We rewrote the bill to get Joe Manchin. But then also, how do we get it passed? And under Schumer's leadership, the version of the talking filibuster they produced was exactly the type of vision we were advocating for. It said there will now be a debate on final passage in which there will be no quorum calls. There will be no other motions to suspend, to adjourn, to recess, to send it back to committee. We are debating final passage until there is a break in the debate. And if there's a break in the debate, we will vote on the bill. That forces the debate to be continuous, and it would be continuous until every senator had either given up or used their 2 votes, 2 speeches under the 2-speech rule, or we had 60 senators ready to close debate. So the 60 vote mechanism would still be there, but the talking filibuster would create other opportunities to close debate if there was a break or an exhaustion of the permitted speeches.
Mike, our next question is, can filibuster reform happen in such a divided legislature? I will also, as a follow, ask about the partisan divide of the legislature. When I came to Washington in 2006, there were moderates in both houses of Congress. They are now much harder to come by. How does the division and that partisanship affect filibuster reform?
Yeah, it's a good question. And at first glance, it seems like, well, this would be very difficult. When white Southerners perfected the art of the filibuster to block civil rights laws in 1891, the Republican leadership in the House, in the Senate at the time, said, like, look, this is out of control. The majority has to be able to pass legislation, and they proposed the first version of what we would call a cloture rule. So a motion to allow the majority to cut off debate after a reasonable period of time and just bring a matter to a final vote. And what happened to that proposal? It was filibustered by the same white Southern Democrats who were filibustering the underlying civil rights bill. That became the template that locked in 75 years of Jim Crow and made filibustering kind of impermeable. So every time the Senate wanted to try to change its rules, the rule changes themselves would be filibustered. So that would suggest, no, there's no chance to change the rules, right? The thing is, as the senator was talking about, Robert Byrd perfected sort of a technique that is sort of a workaround, because ultimately the Senate rules, the arbiter of the Senate rules, like right now, if you have a law and there's a disagreement about what it means, you go to court and a judge or jury decides what that means, right? In the case of the Senate rules, the judge is the U.S. Senate. A majority of the U.S. Senate decides what the Senate rules mean. And so over time, what's happened when obstruction has gotten out of hand, the Senate majority has sort of struck back by reinterpreting the rules to close down avenues of obstruction. There are some funny stories about creative ways that the senators found to avoid having to actually vote on legislation back in the 70s and 80s, that Robert Byrd was, like whack-a-mole, continually trying to like pound down these avenues of obstruction. And one senator refused to vote. The rules require that if a senator refuses to vote, there's then a vote on whether to excuse him based on his or her rationale. And then that roll call vote, another senator would refuse to vote. And then you wind up with all these stacked, like nesting dolls of votes that were all kind of preventing the Senate from actually doing the work it was there to do. So when that kind of stuff has happened, the majority leader usually has made a motion or a point of order to say to the chair, look, that's not what the rules actually mean. The Senate can then vote on whether or not to uphold the ruling of the chair, and the rule now means whatever the Senate just decided it meant. So the biggest, most famous example of this has come around nominations, where the Senate has voted in 2013 on all nominations other than the Supreme Court, and then in 2017 on the Supreme Court nominations. The Senate voted to interpret the rule requiring a 3/5 vote to invoke cloture and end debate to actually mean a simple majority. So it's a functional rewrite of the rules, but using a simple majority vote. And that mechanism is available and is, in fact, at this point, I think, accepted to be really the only way a rule change is going to happen of any like major import. So there's been rule changes that tinker, but if you're going to really attack the no effort filibuster as it currently exists, it's going to be some form of simple majority vote like that.
So, Mike, I also want to ask the next question of you. How can citizens help get reform passed?
Yeah, I mean, look, and this is where we need you, U.S. people. This is an effort to storm the castle, because as the senator was talking about, the system is rigged. The powerful love what they've got, and it's going to take people power to kind of overcome that. Ultimately, the question that everybody needs to be asking of every senator is, do you actually believe in passing the thing you say you support? So if you're advocating about abortion access and reproductive rights, and a senator says, yes, I am there, we should have passed federal abortion rights protection for everybody in the United States, the next question is, are you gonna let Republicans block it with 41 votes? If you support gun safety legislation, if you support climate change, you want union rights, anything has to come with a follow-up question. I don't think you're going to mobilize the American people, and I frankly don't think you're going to mobilize senators around the procedural question of like, are you for or against changing the filibuster rules? But we'd have to make the imperative to deliver real results irresistible for senators. And Senator Merkley and his allies and those of us on the outside can help give senators the toolkit, the understanding, the strategy to actually put in place new rules. But they have to feel the imperative, the incentive to do so from you, saying this is not okay. We are not okay with minority rule deciding what gets passed in the United States Senate.
Yeah, Senator Merkley, our next question is, do you have many colleagues on board with this idea?
Well, the short answer is yes. Right now we have 49 of us on board. We need one more. So that's how close we are. I really want to emphasize that sustaining this in future Congresses means that we have to have those grassroots organizations working on all these different policy issues, all making this part of their agenda, reform of the filibuster. And we had a coalition like that in 2021. I think ultimately there were some 500 groups on board, assembled, saying how important this was to all these different policy sectors, and as well as just good government groups. And that coalition, we have to keep it alive. We have to keep this conversation alive. This is a major reason that Mike and I wrote this book, Filibustered, is so people could really understand how the Senate has been corrupted by this silent, secret veto known as the non-talking or no effort filibuster, and how important it is, if we're going to save our democracy, that we reform it.
And Senator, our next question is, how satisfied are you with the way this topic has been covered in public schools and on college campuses? I'd also add my industry in that too, the media.
Well, I'm hoping all the major reporters on Capitol Hill will read this book so they can really see the scope and history of it, and then be able to have that context. I think we did get a lot of thoughtful coverage during 2021 and into 22 when we had this floor battle, but it is a complicated inside story about process. And that's why we have to translate it to kind of two fundamental things. One is it has rigged the Senate for the powerful. And second, it has rigged the Senate for one party over the other party, because one party has created a simple majority pathway to get their priorities passed, and the other party hasn't. So that if you care about good policy and the cycle of government being completed, and this really applies to when the Republicans might have policy as well. You had President Trump ranting, rage tweeting, get rid of the filibuster, get rid of the filibuster, Mitch McConnell. And why didn't Mitch get rid of it? Well, he didn't get rid of it because what he knew was what President Trump didn't know, which was that the Republicans already had a single majority pathway for their priorities, but keeping the current system also gave them a veto or the Democratic agenda when they're in the minority. So it's a complicated story. How it, I have no idea that how this is getting covered in schools or. It's probably more complicated than elementary and high school political science, but that basic notion that could be conveyed in high school political science class, the founders said, whatever you do, don't repeat the mistake of the Confederation Congress where a supermajority was required and it paralyzed our ability to take on the issues we needed to take on. They lectured us about this. They gave us a constitution where bills are passed by simple majority, and we have ignored them and fallen into the very problem that they were determined to solve. So I think that part is pretty straightforward and should be understood. And I hope a lot of political science classes across our colleges will take this deep dive into Senate history, because this is a really poorly understood part. And that's why we've tried to illuminate the journey on how we ended up where we're at and how much damage it's doing.
So I'd like to ask you each one last question. What is the one thing you want our audience to walk away with this afternoon? First, Senator Merkley.
Well, that our Senate today is failing to deliver government of, by, and for the people, because the issues that ordinary people care about are defeated by 41 vote veto, the silent secret filibuster. And so if you care about the vision of better government and better policies to serve the people, make reforming the filibuster part of your conversation and part of your advocacy.
Mike Zamore?
It will not surprise you, probably after 14 and a half years of working together and writing a book together, that I share the senator's closing thoughts. The gridlock Senate today is a real and present danger to government of, by, and for the people that is our birthright and inheritance from the founders and the Constitution. And if you are frustrated that the government systematically ignores the priorities that are important to you, or if you're worried that we are sliding towards authoritarianism, we need you. Fixing the Senate is crucial to create a better, more fair, more just America for all of us.
Well, thank you to Mike Zamore and Senator Jeff Merkley for joining us. And thanks to our audience for all of your questions. There were so many good ones. We wish we had time to answer them all. The Brennan Center looks forward to seeing you at future events. And to be the first to know about these future events when they're announced, be sure to sign up for the events newsletter at brennancenter.org/events. I'm Kimberly Atkins Stohr, senior opinion writer and columnist at the Boston Globe. Thanks for joining us today.